Chapter 4 of Tractate Zevachim continues in the laws of temple offerings, further on invalidation through improper intents. The first Mishnah says, Beis Shammai holds regarding blood applied to the outside altar, if there were 2 applications required and only one was done, it's sufficient to effect atonement. By a chatas offering where 4 blood applications are required, 2 would be sufficient. Beis Hillel says by a chatas offering it would be sufficient to just make 1 application, meaning by an offering if somebody made the first blood application properly and then made the second with improper intents, called pigul, it would still be valid. If the first and second blood applications were pigul of improper intents for time or place, the offering is pigul and therefore there's liability for consumption by kares, divine punishment. However, by blood applications on the inner altar, if one of them is not done, there's no atonement. So if one is done with pigul, improper intent, the offering is invalid, but there is no liability of kares. The Gemara provides scriptural sources for these points. These are additionally discussed. There are interpretations of relevant verses which are explained according to opinions on this topic. It also sources the opinions as to whether a minimum of 2 applications of blood are needed when 4 are required, and the opposing opinion which said 1 application was required. It brings additional sources for these. It also sources the point that blood applications are always on one single part of the altar, never partially between them. Related, Beis Shammai similarly holds that 2 applications of blood would be sufficient for all offerings, and also if 2 are done with pigul, improper intent, it would disqualify the offering. Beis Hillel would say 1 application is sufficient for all offerings, and if 1 is done with pigul, improper intent, it would disqualify the offering. Related, some hold that the 3 non-essential parts of the blood application of the chatas offering that cannot be performed at night, but they can be done after the death of the owner, there's liability for doing so outside of the temple. Some clarify these steps could have the status of the first initial application, meaning there's liability for being done outside the temple, for being done at night. They can't be done by non-kohanim. A temple service vessel must be used. They must be applied to the horns of the altar. They must be done with a finger. This blood must be washed out of garments, and any leftover blood is considered to have the status of remnants and is poured by the altar base. They're also like the end of the blood service in that they can be done after the owner's death. The meat cannot be eaten from this, and there's no pigul, and it's invalidated if brought inside the temple sanctuary. It debates sources for this concept. These are additionally discussed. It also sources the point that if bloods applied to the inner altar are missing an application, it doesn't affect atonement. There are further points on this. And it sources additional steps of the application services on the pariches curtain, on the altar horns, as to which steps are particularly essential, and various opinions on these. It's explained, there's a comparison in sacrificial procedure between the communal error bull offering and the Yom Kippur he-goat, as even though they're different species, they have the same procedure. And then, based on this, if there are 2 offerings with the same species, the Kohen Gadol's bull chatas and the Yom Kippur bull chatas, some try and derive that here they would therefore have the same procedure. It debates this from principles of scriptural derivation and quotes sources. There are further points. The Mishnah ended by saying, by the inner altar, if only one of the blood applications was done with pigul, improper intent, it's invalid, but there's no punishment of kares. There's a similar concept quoted in the following tractate, Menachos, on a single step of a service being done with pigul. It's a debate there if it would cause the entire offering to become pigul or not. It debates this in comparison to our Mishnah and argues as to what the difference between cases is. This is argued on further. Some define the difference to be that typically you cannot cause pigul during only part of a permitter, the main step of the service, but if somebody does pigul during part of the permitter and is silent during the remainder of the procedure, we assume his incorrect intent was maintained and it's fully pigul. Others disagree and cite seemingly contradictory cases. New Mishnah. The following have no liability for pigul, service with improper intent, for eating them. According to Rabbi Meir, they are select parts of the flour offering, the incense, the flour offering of Kohanim or of the Kohen Gadol, the blood of any offering, and independently brought libations. The sages say even libations brought with animal offerings are excluded from liability of pigul. There's a debate if there's liability by the oil offering brought by a Mesorah, a leper. Some say there is, as the blood of the Asham offering makes it permissible, which is a permitter, and anything with a permitter, whether for eating or for the altar, has liability for pigul. Similarly, the Olah offering's blood application permits its meat to be burned on the altar, and its hide to be used by Kohanim. The bird Olah offering's blood application permits its meat to be burned on the altar. The bird Chatas offering's blood application permits its meat to be eaten by Kohanim. The burned bulls and he-goats blood applications permit their sacrificial parts to be brought on the altar. Some say anything brought on the outer altar, like the Shalomim offering was, there's no liability of pigul for it. The Gemara says there's an opinion that if koimetz, the handful part of the flour offering, is brought onto the altar, if it was pigul, the pigul status is removed, as clearly the burning on the altar can affect its status. Obviously, it's known that there's no liability for pigul by eating the koimetz offering or similar, so it teaches that so long as the offering catches fire, even if it's removed from the altar, it can still be viably put back up there without liability for pigul. Based on this discussion, some derive that if there's a kaimitz offering that was pigul and half was burnt on the altar and half was on the floor, the half on the floor can also then be placed on the altar. In fact, some learned that if there is an offering that's pigul, left over, or impure and it catches fire on the altar, its prohibition is removed. Others debate this, and there's additional discussion here, additionally on some principles of laws of impurity. Anyways, we stated that anything with a permitter for people or the altar, the liability of pigul can apply to it. And it quotes the source for this principle and discusses it further. It also sources the remaining points, like the permitter of the bird offerings, along with related discussion. It does rule in accordance with the opinion that if somebody has pigul intent by something done outside the temple sanctuary, there's pigul, but if it was pigul for something done inside the sanctuary, there's no pigul, and it gives examples. Technically, this has no practical application until Mashiach comes, but it clarifies technically the entire Tractate of Zevachim has no practical application until Mashiach comes, and yet we study it anyways. New Mishnah. Regarding the temple offerings of non-Jewish people, there's a debate if there's liability for pigul, leftovers, or eating them while impure, or slaughtering them outside the temple. The Gemara says further on temple offerings of a non-Jewish person, also, there's no liability of me'ilah from impermissibly benefiting from them. They don't produce teruma tithes. There are no voluntary libations, although there is libations brought by their animal offerings. Others disagree and say, based on the verse, that the temple offerings of a non-Jewish person have the exact same status as that of a Jewish person. It debates these from sources. It discusses this further as to whether there's variation between Jewish and non-Jewish people regarding the acceptance of offerings. New Mishnah. With all the things we listed, that there's exemption for the application of pigul, there's still liability for leftovers or eating them while impure, besides for by blood. Others hold that there is liability by these only when you eat something typically eaten, which would exclude things like wood, incense, and similar. And there's no liability for impurity by those. The Gemara quotes sources for this concept along with related ones by principles of forbidden leftover offerings. There are additional sources quoted as to why blood is an exception by this and related. Anyways, when it's disputed as to whether there's only liability for things typically eaten regarding impurity, some said this applies to impurity of the actual food. Others say this only applies to impurity of the person eating the food. This is debated further. New Mishnah. A temple offering should be offered with the intent of being for the sake of 6 things. For the offering, for the offerer, for God, for the fires, for the smell, and to please God. The chatas and asham offerings also have for the sin that was committed. Rabbi Yossi holds, even if any of these are missing, so it's done without specific intent, it's valid, as the court stipulated that such was permissible. The Gemara quotes sources for these related. It said, a sacrifice brought for the sake of an olah offering is invalid, but if it was slaughtered for a regular, unconsecrated food, it's valid. It sources this, although others disagree. Also, a chata slaughtered for the sake of unconsecration is valid, but if it was slaughtered assuming that it actually was unconsecrated, it's invalid. There are related points and sources the latter statements of the Mishnah. Essentially, the latter point holds that the original owner's intent can define the status of the offering, which there are a few opinions on as to how that relates to other laws. Some say it's a principle that only applies within the temple by things like offerings. Others say that this can also apply by things like the laws of Shabbos. Others disagree, as laws of Shabbos specifically forbid calculated, thought-through labor, so it would go by the intent of the man performing the actual work, not the owner. And that's the end of chapter 4.